On June 21, 1975, Vince Torini, a firefighter with the San Rafael Fire Department, was preparing to do some training when a local man approached him at the station and let him know that something was burning in the fire pit at China Lake State Park. Since it was a hot and dry summer day, it was a fire hazard, so the firefighter and a helper drove out to the park to take a look. Once there, they spotted the fire pit, which was smoking heavily but barely burning. They put out the remaining embers and raked out the ash where they noticed some bone fragments. Vince radioed in that the fire was out, and in his report he described the bone fragments in the ash, suggesting they were probably from a deer. He and the helper left the scene, having accomplished their mission, not knowing that it had not been a deer that had been burned in the fire pit. The bones he had seen were the remains of two people who had been murdered in cold blood. This is Monsters. James Olive, who went by Jim, was born on March 19, 1916 in Austin, Pennsylvania. He had an older sister named Eunice, and the family moved to Panama when Jim was only 9 years old. His father had a friend who had started an English-language newspaper in the country, and he was going to manage the business. Jim began delivering and selling the paper, which began his long career in sales and business ventures. When he returned to the States, he began attending Pennsylvania State College, initially majoring in science. After he and a friend caused a lab explosion, he changed his major to business. He graduated in 1937 and eventually returned to Panama after the newspaper was sold off. He attempted to develop the land and sell the plots, but wasn't successful. In 1941, Jim was drafted into the U.S. Army and worked as a mail censor, ensuring nobody was sending sensitive information in the mail, whether intentional or not. It was while he was serving in Burma that his mother mailed him a picture of herself with a young woman named Naomi Wagner. Naomi was born in 1923 in Cuba, New York, in an area where the Olives had built up one of the largest dairy farms and had become part of the social elite. When Naomi was a child, her mother died and her father remarried, at which point he adopted her out to another family while keeping her younger brother. It likely left some pretty big emotional scars on the young woman. Her new family was friends with the Olives, which is how she met Jim's mother. Jim was immediately smitten by the attractive young woman, and while he was home on leave for a month, he courted and married Naomi in 1944 before being sent to the Philippines. Jim was discharged at the end of the war, and the couple moved to Panama where the real estate market had picked up and he was able to sell off the property he had developed. After that, he began working as an advertising manager for Standard Oil of New Jersey's Panamanian operation. After 4 years, he became the division manager for Esso's El Salvador operation, where he was given a company-owned house with a staff of maids, gardeners, and a cook. Eventually, Naomi convinced Jim to move back to the U.S., and after his mother died in the early 1950s, he used his inheritance to purchase an 8-unit apartment complex in St. Petersburg, Florida. With Naomi helping manage the apartment, Jim had free time to pursue a number of get-rich-quick schemes, none of which made him any money. In 1955, he purchased a Phillips Petroleum franchise in Norfolk, Virginia. Jim had seen the area as a rapidly growing market where he could make a lot of money, but unfortunately, he wasn't alone. Soon, there were 15 major oil companies operating in the area, selling their products to service stations, and Jim was swamped with competition. At the same time, after 12 years of marriage, Naomi was interested in having a child, but they were unable to have their own, so they chose to adopt. Back then, they just mentioned their desire to adopt to some friends, and a local doctor said he could help them out. The doctor was treating the teen daughter of a prominent family who had gotten pregnant. He arranged for the baby to be adopted by the Olives, which was made official through paperwork at the county welfare department. Marlene Louise Olive was born on January 15, 1959 in Norfolk, Virginia. Naomi's approach to motherhood showed early signs of her deteriorating mental health. Her extreme overprotective behavior became apparent at the time of Marlene's first 6 months, as she made everyone wear masks while interacting with the infant. That practice affected early bonding opportunities because infants usually form attachments through facial expressions and nonverbal cues. Not long after the adoption, Jim's business went bankrupt and he lost their life savings. He was offered a job as the sales and distribution manager of Tenneco's operations in Ecuador. Jim felt right at home in the South American country as he spoke fluent Spanish and was well versed in Latin American culture, but things weren't so great for Naomi. She became increasingly paranoid while there, believing other women were whispering about her and the local merchants were stealing from her. Naomi was incredibly scared of mental health treatment because her mother had been admitted to inpatient treatment before she had died. She had always been scared that she would inherit her mother's mental illness and that she would also be put in the hospital. Despite her fears, family members were able to convince her to see a psychiatrist, and she and Jim attended 4 group therapy sessions where the doctor diagnosed her with schizoid personality with paranoid features. He prescribed Naomi antidepressants and tranquilizers. Over the following year, Naomi's mental health seemed to improve while on medication, and Jim successfully brokered a deal for a local oil company to buy Tenneco's Ecuador branch. That essentially caused him to be out of a job, and the family decided to move back to the U.S. He was given a position at a Tenneco branch in New Mexico, but it was a lower position with less pay. He was eventually fired and ended up brokering a huge deal for Gulf Oil to purchase part of the oil refinery he had just sold to a local company in Ecuador. They weren't able to use the facility at full capacity, and the partnership increased production in the area. When Marlene was 10 years old, she found her adoption papers while playing in her father's home office. The discovery had a deep effect on her emotional state and led to increased struggles with feelings of displacement. Marlene would later say that she had immediately thought the adoption meant that Jim and Naomi had bought her and that they didn't really love her. Of course, Jim explained that it was the opposite. They had chosen her specifically to be their child because they loved her so much. The relationship between Marlene and Jim didn't seem to change. The girl was always overly attached to her father, but the knowledge of the adoption made Marlene resent Naomi more than she already had. Naomi's mental health problems, compounded by her drinking, were difficult enough, but knowing she wasn't really her mother allowed Marlene to disconnect from her even more. The mother and daughter became increasingly abusive to each other. When Marlene was angry, she would bombard Naomi with questions about her birth mother. Naomi would become so enraged that she would tell Marlene that her birth mother didn't want children and neither did she, reinforcing the girl's feelings that Naomi didn't love her. The family ended up back in Ecuador as a huge oil reserve was discovered and an oil boom was happening. Jim worked to manage Gulf Oil's operations in the area, but eventually the government got more involved and wanted the operation in the hands of locals, and Jim was let go. He tried to get some of his friends to invest in a horse breeding business in Texas, but many of them were already in debt from one of his many previous schemes that never ended up making any money. Then Jim saw an ad for franchise opportunities with a business consultancy company. They were setting up shops all over the country and were looking for people to run branches. After looking at a map of available regions, Jim decided that Marin County, California would be the perfect spot. Southern California was already speckled with franchises, but the north end of the San Francisco Bay Area was wide open. It was also an up-and-coming area that was relatively warm and had a good amount of Spanish speakers, which would make his ability to speak fluent Spanish an asset to the business. In the middle of 1973, the Olives packed up their belongings and headed north to the last place they would live, the Terra Linda neighborhood in San Rafael, California. Once in the States, Marlene started showing rebellious behaviors, including shoplifting and substance abuse, which made the family's problems even worse. Her father hoped the issues came from negative peer influence rather than deeper family problems. Naomi's condition got worse because she refused professional help. Even though she had already seen a therapist briefly with positive results, she was still extremely afraid of being institutionalized. Charles Riley, who went by Chuck, was born on May 2, 1955 and grew up in Marin County with his parents Oscar and Joanne Riley. He was the oldest of 3 children. His childhood in Santa Venetia proved challenging due to his weight problems that started at age 5. On top of that, he wasn't the most gifted academically and ended up repeating the 3rd grade. As he got older, his talent became apparent as he began riding dirt bikes, which he would repair and rebuild himself. His friends eventually started bringing their motorcycles to his house in the evenings to have him do repairs. By the time he was 15, Chuck had ballooned to over 300 pounds, and his mother had to buy large men's pants and cut about a foot off the length so they would fit his 48-inch or 122-centimeter waist. They offered him $1 for every pound he lost and $5 for every inch around his waist he lost, but it didn't help. Then a doctor put him on a low-calorie diet, but Chuck wouldn't stick to it. That's when the doctor prescribed Dexedrine, a powerful stimulant that is more commonly used now to treat ADHD. Chuck began using the drug as speed to give himself energy throughout the day. Before long, he was taking handfuls of the pills and staying up for days. Once Chuck was 16 years old, he bought a 1964 Corvair for $25 and used it to practice racing. His dream was to become a race car driver, but that would never become a reality. When the Corvair died, he saved up to buy a 1964 Chevy Nova. He would race that car on the highway, and when the engine blew, he replaced it with a 1969 Buick Skylark. By his later teens, his grades had plummeted, and he didn't really spend much of his time in class. He was also getting into trouble out of school, including shoplifting and stealing money from his parents. He would use the money to buy stuff for other teens in an effort to buy friends. Eventually, Chuck started smoking marijuana here and there to come down after using his weight loss meds as speed. Then he started smoking daily, and then he began selling it. He started off small, selling to friends here and there, but as his connections grew, so did his operation. Then, when the U.S. cracked down on drugs coming into the country from Mexico, the reduction in supply actually helped Chuck. He was able to charge more for higher quality pot, and by the time he was 18 years old, he was a prominent dealer in the area. He was actually the leading marijuana dealer at Terra Linda High School, where Marlene attended. In Chuck's junior year of high school, he dropped out, and since his father demanded he get a job, he began delivering pizzas in the evenings. That didn't last very long, though, before Chuck quit and spent that time hanging out selling drugs. By then, his inventory included cocaine, something he began using heavily himself. The only benefits of his increased drug use was that the cocaine, along with the Dexedrine, finally made him start losing weight. Not really the way you want to lose weight, but by the time he met Marlene, he was down to 250 pounds. It was in late 1974 that Chuck made his usual appearance at the high school during an extended mid-morning break to sell drugs to the students. While there, he noticed a girl being picked on and found out that she had dropped acid and was having a bad trip. He got the boys who were taunting her to leave and tried to comfort her before a friend grabbed her and led her away. Chuck developed a crush on the girl, who he later found out was 15-year-old Marlene Olive. Marlene did not find him attractive at first, but their relationship blossomed after he launched a dedicated effort to change himself. He transformed his appearance by losing more weight and buying new clothes. He also learned Spanish phrases to catch her attention. Chuck had never dated anyone before Marlene, and his lack of experience made him an easy target for manipulation. Their relationship quickly became one-sided. Marlene took the domineering, aggressive, and influential role of leadership, while Chuck remained passive, insecure, and greatly dependent upon her. Marlene controlled Chuck through several tactics. She convinced him she had magical powers and could hypnotize him, which Chuck believed without question. Chuck gradually cut ties with his friends and family. His world revolved around Marlene. Chuck was actually well liked by Jim and Naomi. He sent flowers to Naomi and Marlene for Christmas and gave Jim a nice bottle of scotch. He had spent most of his life bribing people in order to gain their friendship, so he made easy work of Marlene's parents. Marlene's power over Chuck became clear through his desperate behavior. He tried to end his life twice after she briefly left him. She kept him under control by threatening to leave whenever he disobeyed her instructions. His emotional dependence made him follow her every command. Their relationship was so toxic that both of them recognized it. They even agreed that Electric Light Orchestra's Evil Woman perfectly described their dynamic. Chuck's drug use grew worse during that time, and he later admitted that it led to, quote, some really incoherent thinking, and fueled a, quote, us against them kind of thinking. Marlene and Chuck acted out her sexual assault fantasies, tying her up, cutting off her clothes, and even holding a knife to her throat during sex. She would use his hunting knife to masturbate, and it worried him enough that he put tape on the blade to keep her from cutting herself. She even started using a .22 caliber pistol as a sexual aid on herself, and there were times when Chuck didn't know if it was loaded or not. Chuck fell deeper into Marlene's dark fantasies and criminal behavior as time went on. The couple stole about $6,000 worth of merchandise in a shoplifting spree before police caught them in March of 1975. That first adult arrest marked the beginning of Chuck's criminal record. Marlene's influence would soon lead him to commit more serious crimes. On June 21, 1975, Marlene got into a fight with her mother that spiraled out of control. She called Chuck and said, quote, get your gun, we've got to kill the bitch today. She told Chuck that she was going shopping with her father, which would leave Naomi home alone. She told him she would leave the front door unlocked. Chuck would later claim that he was under the influence of LSD as he entered the Olive residence while Naomi slept. He had brought with him his .22 caliber revolver, a claw hammer, and a knife. Chuck initially tried to kill Naomi with the hammer but failed and stabbed her in the chest instead. Jim came home while Chuck was still there and saw Naomi lying in bed covered in blood. He tried to stop the attacker by grabbing a knife and moving toward him, but Chuck shot him 4 times, which killed him instantly. Once Marlene's parents were dead, she and Chuck had sex and then removed anything identifiable from their bodies. Wallet, ID, and jewelry were all taken. Marlene rummaged through Jim's wallet and Naomi's purse and pocketed a number of credit cards and Jim's checkbook. She gave any cash she found to Chuck. They did some minor cleanup in her parents' bedroom, then cleaned themselves up and changed clothes. After that, they walked into town where they went to a shopping center where Chuck's younger brother Kelly worked before walking to Chuck's house. From there, they were picked up by some friends and went back to their house to smoke weed and snort cocaine. The two couples went out to dinner and then Chuck and Marlene returned to the Olive residence, but they didn't stay long. They drove around in Jim's car for a while before ending up at a drive-in movie theater where they watched the movie Death Race 2000. It was during the movie that the pair came up with a plan to dispose of the bodies. Back home, they wrapped the bodies in sheets and took them to China Camp State Park. They placed the bodies in a barbecue pit, put logs around them, and poured gasoline over it all. Chuck put a lit cigarette into a book of matches and set it on the bodies to act as a fuse. They fled the scene and the fire ignited as they were driving away. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Chuck got up and headed back to China Camp. He stopped behind a strip mall to pick up some wood from a pile of broken pallets and then continued to the burn site. Once there, the fire was still smoldering, but both bodies had not completely burned. Some of Naomi's rib bones and her skull were still recognizable. Jim's legs had burned completely, but much of his torso and head were still intact. Chuck pushed the remaining body parts into a pile and surrounded them with wood from the pallets and other branches he found nearby. He poured more gasoline over everything and lit it, without the makeshift fuse this time. Chuck needed to get home before his parents woke up so they wouldn't think he had been out all night, and Marlene didn't want to stay home alone, so he dropped her off in the parking lot of a church near his house. After he got home and pretended to have just woken up, Marlene arrived at his house as if she hadn't just been with him all night. Later that morning, Vince Torrini and his helper arrived and put out the fire. Since the huge blaze had had enough time to finish burning the bodies, the firefighters thought that someone had burned a deer carcass. After breakfast, Chuck and Marlene went back to China Camp again with the intention of setting another fire. But when they arrived, the place was populated with people riding dirt bikes and the fire pit had clearly been watered down. The couple put more wood into the pit but didn't light it. They waited until the afternoon and returned to the camp with the Olive's bloody mattress, and since the bikers had left, they put the mattress in the burn pit and set another fire. Marlene and Chuck stayed in the Olive house after the murders. They cleaned up the scene and went about their lives like nobody would notice that her parents had disappeared. The couple went to concerts, shopped, and spent money with Marlene's dead parents' credit cards. Their long-term plan was to collect life insurance money and move to Ecuador, though it's not clear how they were going to inform the insurance company that Jim and Naomi were dead or explain how they died. They likely hadn't figured out that detail themselves. By then, Jim had brought a partner to his business. He was a man named Philip Royce who attended the same church as Jim, and he was also interested in starting a consulting business. Jim convinced Philip to partner with him, and they could just expand his current business, and that's what they had done. After not having heard from Jim for several days, Philip called the police, who went to the Olive home for a welfare check. It was there that they spoke to Marlene, who couldn't give them a reasonable explanation for where her parents had gone. At first, she said they went to Lake Tahoe, but then she changed her story and claimed that Jim had killed Naomi and disappeared with the body. When it was clear that the authorities didn't believe that story, she made up a story about both of her parents having been killed by the Hells Angels, who must have also taken the bodies with them for some reason. Eventually, the police searched the house and found an unopened letter she had written to Chuck that read, quote, "I have no guilty feelings at all about my folks. None. Neither should you. Relax." At some point, the police got information about the barbecue pit and they searched it on June 25, 1975. It was there that they found pieces of human remains. Marlene and Chuck were arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Chuck provided a detailed confession that implicated himself and Marlene. After trying to convince the police that one of her many other lies were true, Marlene eventually claimed that Chuck had murdered her parents on his own and then held her hostage, forcing her to do drugs. Of course, the evidence didn't back that up. By the time Chuck's trial began, he had retracted his confession and made a different confession while under hypnosis, which placed most of the blame on Marlene. He claimed that Marlene had been using a hammer earlier that day to repair a shoe and that he had used it to beat her mother almost to death. Chuck said that he ended up stabbing Naomi to death in order to put her out of her misery. He said that Jim came home, saw him, and threatened to kill him, so he shot him in self-defense. The jury listened to both the original confession and the new confession while Chuck was supposedly under hypnosis. The prosecution was able to debunk the hypnosis by pointing out that a hypnotized person will speak in the present tense because they believe they're at the place and time they're being told. During Chuck's hypnosis, he only spoke in the past tense, leading many to believe the whole thing was fabricated. Chuck Riley was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Marlene was tried in juvenile courts and she had recently turned 16 when the murders took place. Psychological evaluations during her trial revealed a troubled individual who remained competent to stand trial. The judge ended up ruling that Marlene, quote, did encourage, instigate, aid, abet, and act as accomplice in the homicides of her parents. She was sentenced to a juvenile detention facility and was to be released by her 21st birthday unless the youth authority determined she had not been rehabilitated, in which case she could be kept in custody up to age 23. Due to changes in the way the death penalty should be given as a sentence, Chuck's death sentence was changed to 2 life sentences at the end of 1976. While in prison, he earned his GED, associate's and bachelor's degrees, and took part in behavioral programs. His rehabilitation looked promising, but he was continually denied parole. He was finally granted parole in December of 2015 after serving 40 years. Since then, he has remained out of the spotlight. Marlene's story after release took a very different path. She was allowed to live outside the juvenile facility with a juvenile services worker in preparation for her release, but just weeks before she was to be officially released, she ran away. She traveled to New York City and became involved in sex work. She was eventually arrested and returned to the facility. She was released in 1980 when she turned 21, but did not live a crime-free lifestyle. She was arrested at least 7 times over the following decade for forgery, drug offenses, fraud, and theft. She served 2 different 1-year sentences in the early 80s, one for forgery and the other for a parole violation. In 1986, she was arrested as the ringleader of a major counterfeiting and forgery operation in Los Angeles. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and after her release, she continued to get in trouble with the law for various crimes related to fraud and forgery. Marlene Olive's difficult adoption history, mixed with her mother's worsening mental health and her father's constant absence, might have set the stage for disaster, but she always had a choice. She made the choice to convince her boyfriend to kill her parents, and her behavior after her release reinforces that she only cared about herself, taking advantage of people and even killing for her own personal gain, like the monster she is. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.